Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to bring you my Dragonflight Season 2 10.1 Disc Priest Guide with everything you need for raids and Mythic Plus. With this video, we're going to talk not only about how you want to play, how you want to execute this disc in raids and keys, but also some of the research tools you can use to help you prepare for incoming fights. And as well, on the YouTube channel, we're going to have a lot of boss guides coming up, as well as dungeon guides. So if you're enjoying the content, be sure to subscribe. And we also have a Patreon. We just got started, so check it out in the description down below. With that said, here is the talent tree as follows, and it's also linked in the description as well. This is going to be about your standard bread and butter for disc in raiding, and there's a couple different variances that we're going to talk about really quickly to kind of get you familiar with it, but it goes as follows: that Sanguine Teachings, giving you like Leech, can also be exchanged with things like Vampiric Embrace. There's a few different sort of options you have on the way for things like utility, things along the lines of taking like Crystalline Reflection here, where your shields are adding extra damage when they're consumed, Bulwark for more defensive value. I personally really like the Fade for extra casts of Fade, and Light's Inspiration are all good, viable options to be able to improve your defensive value. There's also certain times where you may need certain utility, and you may not be able to take spells like Holy Nova and Rhapsody, which just got buffed in 10.07, I believe, where this is a pretty decent spell to be able to use, especially if people are stacked up together, but it's sort of a luxury that you can drop and flex into more damage reduction or utility as you need to. When it comes to the spec tree, again, there's going to be a couple little variances and a couple different options that you have on hand. With the extra mana that you're having access to with patch 10.1, when they reduce the mana cost of a number of different spells, you may or may not need Solace going forward, but it's always a good spell to be able to take. Since 10.05, we've been playing a lot heavier with Shadow Covenant builds, and players have opted either for the extra 10% increased damage and healing out of Shadow Covenant, or the longer duration, have a bit of a wider window, but both of them work pretty well. You're going to have these sort of like core 4 talents, or even 5 talents if you include Light's Wrath, which are almost always selected by pretty much every single raid build. Evangelism, extending the duration of your atonements. Expiation, while it requires you to refresh your Purge the Wicked quite a lot more frequently, it is a massive amount of damage. And our new tier set, which we'll talk about a little later, is also a substantial increase in your damage to Purge the Wicked. Harsh Discipline, buffing up your penance, is always going to be a major priority for you to proc and activate before you're beginning that sort of ramp sequence. And Twilight Equilibrium is pretty much the backbone of a lot of your gameplay, where you're weaving between shadow and light to be able to put together your burst of damage. Light's Wrath, of course, is just going to be a hard lock. It's just very beneficial, but it can be kind of difficult to use. And finally, we have some of the Blaze and Wheel and Woe talents, where some people have been opting for like Train of Thought, Divine Aegis, and we've even been experimenting with some Aegis of Wrath type stuff to increase the amount of absorbs you have access to. I probably will do a video about this a little bit later on once we get to see more of where 10.1's heading. But for now, this is going to be the general recommended build that we have going on, because this playstyle is all about building up a large quantity of atonements, extending their duration with evangelism, and then unleashing really like a flurry of attacks to be able to heal up all of your allies. With this, you're going to not only be buffing your damage by using spells like Schism, which debuffs the target, Shadow Covenant, which buffs you, Twilight Equilibrium, which also is buffing your spells if you're using them in the right order, and things like Expiation front-loading your damage, or Harsh Discipline activating more effectiveness for your penance. So a lot of the talents in the spec tree are built off the back of improving your damage in a variety of different ways, and then it's up to you to be able to time your ramps correctly, and then be able to sequence your abilities correctly to be able to deal the most damage possible in a concentrated window of time, and then after that ramp, you can sort of relax and get into downtime. We'll talk about that more in just a sec. When it comes to the new tier set bonus, the Disc 2-piece is insanely good, increasing your Purge the Wicked damage and increasing your Radiance healing. But it is outshined, of course, by our 4 set getting even stronger, with atonements applied by Powered Radiance always lasting 3 seconds longer, and you have a chance for your spells to cause your next Radiance to be instant and cost 50% less mana. This can always accumulate to multiple charges, and it is obscenely good, allowing you to have a very large amount of your Radiances discounted in cost, which increases your effectiveness, your efficiency, so you can be more aggressive with applying atonements. And it also can allow Radiance to be just a stronger tool and a more consistent tool when you're ramping and you're maybe running a little bit behind and you have to move for a lot of mechanics in a raid, and even in for an Ad Plus environment. This is also insane because it's going to be an immediate button to get you out of danger when you need to and be able to keep your allies alive. So The priority is going to be on getting this force set as fast as possible, and you shouldn't worry too much about dropping your old force set either. Might be a bit of a loss losing out on some of those extra shields with your 4-piece, but this new tier set is absolutely worth getting as quickly as you can. When it comes to properly executing a ramp, it can always be very difficult to properly visualize all of the work and all of the effort that's really going into it. So what I wanted to highlight here is Warcraft Logs, the timeline view. And so before we show some of the gameplay itself, I wanted to show, if you go to the timeline section in the top right with logs, go to the cast section as well, then you're going to be able to start breaking down what spells were cast and at what moments were they utilized. And so with this, I want to use it to be able to highlight that sort of ramp sequence that we've been talking about before in terms of what it actually is going to be looking like. So as we stated previously, you're going to be applying Atonement to as many allies as you possibly can before incoming raid damage is happening, extend their duration, and then be able to start dealing damage. So you'll see I'm casting Smites. You can also use Solace or Mind Blast in advance of your ramp to be able to proc Harsh Discipline, then refreshing Purge the Wicked, followed up by using Rapture, and you'll often use Rapture and Evangelism together as your major cooldowns, applying shields as much as you possibly can thanks to Rapture, following it up with your double Radiance, and a lot of times I like to apply these to one range and one melee to make sure that they're hitting a variety of targets, not overlapping onto each other, and using Shadow Fiend in between those casts. Then you're extending the duration of Evangelism. So you're spending about a 15 or 18 second window before damage is happening, applying atonements to allies, then extending the duration. And in this entire period of time, you're not dealing damage. Once you have finished applying those atonements, then you can begin with your damage profile. This will start with using things like Twilight Equilibrium, which buffs your shadow and light spells as long as you alternate properly, and also utilizing Schism and Shadow Covenant. So going into Schism, followed by the Light's Wrath, followed by the Shadow Covenant. Now, if some people are having logs where everyone kind of does things a little bit differently with this, seen some people who are having longer Shadow Covenant duration and weaving Twilight Equilibrium in between. A lot of logs, myself included, we're always opting to try to fit in as many shadow spells as we possibly can during that 35% buffed shadow window and the 15% buff that we have from Schism. So utilizing Shadow Covenant and hitting Penance, which becomes Dark Reprimand once you use Shadow Covenant. Penance is always going to be one of your highest damage abilities after Light's Wrath, and so if there is super heavy damage, you want to make sure you front load it. And if you know that the damage is going to happen a second or two later, you can sort of delay utilizing spells like Mind Blast or Solace to be able to buy you a little bit of time. And so that's why in logs you'll see just a bit of variance as to what's going on, because it allows you to sort of delay certain casts to be able to net out more healing a little bit later on and perfectly time the extra damage that you have. Because whenever you're casting Light's Wrath, it's a full committal. But there's more spells on the back end that you can utilize to min-max where you want to be able to concentrate the most healing possible. I realize this is a lot, so keeping in mind if you wanted to get used to it and sort of practicing on a target dummy, hit your Schism, hit your Light's Wrath, hit Shadow Covenant, followed up with Penance into Solace, which benefits from Twilight Equilibrium and Wheel and Woe, following it up with your Mind Blasts, refreshing in between with Purge the Wicked if you need to, trying to get your Dark Halo out as well, which is also buffed by Shadow Covenant. And what I like to do, especially with our Purge the Wickeds being buffed now, is trying to squeeze in, if I can, a Shadow or Death outside of Execute to benefit from Expiation. If there's still like more damage to be going out, if there's still more healing to be done, it becomes quite strong. You also are going to have times where you might want to refresh your Purge the Wicked depending on your duration in between your Mind Blast casts, so you're always able to consume more of that dot up time. But breaking it down, this is as many high damage abilities as you can fit into in your narrow window of Shadow Covenant duration, Schism debuff duration as possible to reverse the incoming damage. In between all of these high profile ramps and these high effort ramps, you are going to have a lot more mana in 10.1 than you had previously at the start of the expansion, which means that you are going to have a lot of excess powered Radiance charges that you always want to make sure that you are consuming and taking advantage of. Not only is it really strong direct healing to the targets, but it's also going to be very efficient atonement application. And so what you're able to do is you're not only able to use those Radiance casts, you're able to use 4 of those Radiance casts in between each of your ramps, ramps, but you're also going to be able to take advantage of Renew quite a lot more in the incoming patch, thanks to it being buffed alongside Power Word Shield, both in terms of its effectiveness in healing and reducing its mana cost. What this means is that whenever there's going to be more incoming damage and you don't have Rapture or Evangelism, because you frequently use them together, you'll be able to use a lot of Renew casts followed up by Radiance to be able to create these sort of mini ramps. And so just like I said before, your priority is on applying all these atonements and then dealing all of this damage, and then you're able to relax. You are not, as a Disc Priest, a healer that is constantly trying to heal every single incoming mechanic that happens to players. But when you have extra Radiance charges in between your major cooldowns, that's where you want to combine those Radiance charges together, as well as some extra manually applied atonements through Renew, to be able to reverse smaller bursts of damage that might happen onto the raid. So you'll see a lot of footage, for example, of Rashok, which was our most recent raid test before the patch hit, where I am applying extra atonements when I can in between the incoming damage to be able to provide a bit of a burst and a bit of a boost to my healing output as the fight continues to pulse large quantities of raid-wide damage. So I'm not always able to hit every single window, and I'm not always able to reverse all the damage and be spot healing all the time, but there's a lot of moments where you're able to contribute a bit of extra healing in between your major cooldowns, and then identifying the next mechanic that you have to focus on, where you would want to ramp and you want to prepare for healing. Timing your ramps as a Disciplined Priest can always be immensely challenging, especially very early on in the tier when you're looking to research fights. What I want to highlight is a website called lorgs.io, which does an excellent job of breaking down specific encounters, the top logs for those encounters, and when abilities are being used. Like I showed you before with the timeline, it's easy to be able to, well, it's time consuming to pull up the logs and look at every single little area where a Disc Priest used their abilities, but Lorgs does an excellent job of making that so much easier for you. So how this works is you're going to be able to select a certain boss fight, and then when you select it for Disc Priest, you can start looking at the variety of cooldowns and the variety of abilities that the boss casts. And so when you're able to look at Rapture and Evangelism, you can quickly see for all of the logs as you go all the way down, Rapture is used first, followed by Evangelism. And you're seeing at 3:18, Rapture gets used, and then 14 seconds later, Evangelism gets used. Hopefully my math is okay. With that, you're able to see how everyone's pairing these cooldowns together. You're also able to see when other utility abilities like Barrier could be utilized, and that's also going to be an effective way to help your team. But more than that, you're able to see a lot of patterns emerge for when players are frequently using their abilities. And then when you go to the boss itself in the top left corner, you're able to see what abilities they are also going to be using. I'm going to have some preliminary guides as well on Wowhead, linked in the description below, but this is a great way to double check and verify how people are ramping for certain encounters and what mechanics are happening at specific moments. So you can see, for example, here, we're having the Chilling Blast from the boss coming out, and it's happening around every 30 seconds or so. And with that, players are able to have their Evangelism and Rapture utilized together at the beginning of the fight, 2 seconds before the Chilling Blast goes out onto the raid, giving them time to be able to wind up their lengthy Light's Wrath casts very soon afterwards, and be able to pump as much healing as they possibly can. You're also able to see when people are using things like Shadow Covenant, and noticing in this pattern that players are putting together, like we said, their large ramp with Evangelism, Light's Wrath, Shadow Covenant, and then 30-40 seconds later, putting together a smaller ramp where they're not doing as much healing to reverse the damage of the Chilling Blast, but they're once again focusing their mana consumption and their cooldowns and their resources to another specific moment in time to reverse that incoming damage. And so this is where you're able to start picking together patterns and preparing for these incoming fights for when you want to time those abilities. Otherwise, it can be kind of a trial and error of fitting it just perfectly at the right moment, at the right time, especially when there's not that many logs to be able to go off of. And so understanding the mechanics, and like I said, I'm going to have a primer in my written guides linked in the description down below for what mechanics you're wanting to be ramping for and wanting to be able to prepare for. While there is a ton of things going on with Raid, for the sake of brevity, be sure to check out my written guide in the description down below, as well as gems, enchants, consumables, embellishments. All of those details will be featured in my written guides. Now, let's dive into Mythic Plus talents. As you'll see here, there's going to be, once again, a couple different options and some choices as to what you are able to select. This build is notably not the squid build that we talked about in our previous build about 2-3 months ago at 10:05. This instead is going to focus less on Mindbender and more on Blaze of Light. So while Mindbender and the Squid setup does incredible amounts of AoE damage, it also is not going to net out as many penance casts and not quite as much healing as you would otherwise get with something that's going to be like a Blaze build. As a result, you're going to lose a little bit of overall damage by speccing into this, but you're going to gain a lot greater consistency when it comes to being able to reverse incoming damage on your party and being able to have the damage resources on hand to be able to heal through steadier amounts of damage like you'll see out of encounters like Khajiit in Halls of Infusion, which are constantly ticking damage onto you. With that, there also are a couple different choices. Same thing that I mentioned before in the raid talents, Holy Nova and Rhapsody can be good, but I also think of them quite as luxuries. If there's times where I need more defensives, I go to Light's Inspiration for fade value, or improved fade, or bulwark, to be able to have a little bit better strength preparing for incoming boss fights, or even just deadly trash packs. There's a lot of dungeons, maybe 4 of them, that require disease dispels, but not all of them. The new affixes Incorporeal can be affected by Shackle Undead, and you should always talent into Shackle Undead on the Incorporeal weeks. The Entangled affix can be removed by using Fade and Phantasm, which removes snares from yourself, and I particularly enjoy having Fade cooldown reduction for this, so you can just always have Fade up every single time to remove the entangling without having to move out of that field. And on the Spectre, as I mentioned before, this sort of core 4 right here, you're taking Lenience instead of Evangelism, but Expiation, Harsh Discipline, and Twilight Equilibrium are very much the core parts of Discipline, both in raids and M+ at the moment. You will be, of course, taking a Shadow Covenant increased duration, and it's even possible to drop Solace if you needed to, but it is still very good mana efficiency, and chain pulling mob after mob can also put quite a damper onto your mana. There's a couple different areas where you could use Dominate Mind, particularly in things like Vortex Pinnacle, but you don't often use it a lot. A lot of the gameplay loop for Season 2 Dragonflight Disc Priest is going to be on maintaining Purge the Wicked on as many enemies as possible and maximizing your effectiveness with things like Twilight Equilibrium. That 15% rolling buff that you receive weaving between Shadow and Light is tremendously effective for increasing your overall damage, but also having an easier time not having to be directly healing allies with healing spells. As I mentioned before, you're using things like Shield or Renew to be able to apply longer duration atonements, and then Radiance is shorter duration, but it's applying it to everybody all at once. And so when you're applying all of these atonements to allies, you get a large upfront heal, but then you also want to prepare for a pseudo mini ramp of sorts in a 5-man environment to deal as much damage as you possibly can to top off allies through incoming damage. So once again, remembering the core ability or the core talents that we have in Expiation and Harsh Discipline, maintaining your Purge the Wicked, and then keeping an eye on your weak auras to be able to know when you're having the increased effectiveness out of your penance, the extra bolts from your penance, make a tremendous difference in being mana efficient and keeping your allies alive. Some of the big mistakes that I see from Disc Priest players when it comes to dungeons is sort of over-applying atonements or trying to cast healing spells directly onto somebody in danger, when you really have to start trusting that your damage abilities are going to properly heal your allies and recover them from the damage that they're taking. And so when you don't have really heavy amounts of damage going out, you should be weaving Twilight Equilibrium by frequently using Shadow Covenant if your mana can afford it, to be able to buff up your shadow spells and provide some stable level of healing to your allies, and then weaving Purge the Wicked onto multiple enemies to apply or refresh the debuff onto them, while also weaving Twilight Equilibrium. And that can look something along the lines of casting Mind Blast onto a target and refreshing Purge the Wicked onto a new target. Then once you've cast that light spell, your next shadow spell will be buffed. And so if you have another Mind Blast cast, you can then cast it onto that target and apply a new Purge the Wicked onto another target. If you have Shadow Covenanted up, your penance is a dark spell, and then you could follow it up with another penance to be able to not only deal damage, but also to spread Purge the Wickeds to more allies or to more enemies and then refresh those debuffs onto them. By having a large amount of your damage and your subsequent healing in trash packs coming from Purge the Wicked, it's incredibly noticeable for when you don't have that debuff rolling onto allies. Keep in mind, mana is often a limiter, but not as much in 10.1, especially with the tier set. And so you need to make sure that you're not overspending some of your high-end resources, like things like Powered Radiance. The new tier set allows you to have the ability to be instant cast and cost less mana, but it doesn't give you more charges. And so a very frequent mistake I see with players is using Radiance just to be able to heal people and not following up the atonement value with damage. And then they run out of Radiance charges, more damage happens, and then people start bleeding out and people start dying. An easy way to be able to solve this is, of course, making sure you're used to using every last second of the atonement duration that you have, and leaning on things like Rapture as you go into trash pulls by shielding all of your allies, setting up those 15-second atonements, and then later refreshing them with a Radiance to heal allies if you actually need to. Another thing is having double charge of pain suppression is insanely good utility and should really be utilized as frequently as you possibly can. If you have a ultra stable tank, think about using it onto yourself or other allies when there's boss fights that deal large amounts of damage. There's a number of different times where I've pain suppression myself on tyrannical boss fights because I knew that my tank would not need that resource. And so not using one of these cooldowns and just letting it sit there and stagnate is going to just make your life a lot harder. And a lot of the incoming dungeons for Dragonflight are not going to be as much on the healer playing around the affixes alone, but you will have a number of different encounters, definitely in Brackenhide Hollow as a good example, where being able to heal and top off allies faster and burst them back to life faster is only going to make your life easier and make it so that you're able to get to a point where you can just add damage and help the run accelerate. The very first boss, for example, has a Grievous-like mechanic, which drops players down to like 30% health or 20% health, and then leaves a massive dot on them. And so the faster you're able to top them off, the less healing overall that you're going to be able to do. Disc in Dungeons is considerably better than it was at the beginning of the expansion, but you need to be getting used to playing around the feedback loop of Twilight Equilibrium, and I would highly recommend getting to a point where you're spending 4 or 5 minutes hitting a target dummy without breaking combat and letting all your cooldowns reset to get into the flow of taking advantage of your Mind Blast charges and Shadow Covenant use in particular, and making sure you're also maintaining Purge the Wicked on as many targets as you can. You can always be using for that sort of mini ramp, just like we talked about in Raid, having Purge the Wicked on as many enemies as you can, hitting Shadow Covenant, and with a longer duration, you can use it at the start, follow it up with Schism, and then following it up with your high damage spells and weaving Twilight Equilibrium. So for example, you can have Shadow Covenant up, cast Schism, cast a Solace, cast Penance, follow it up with a Smite cast or a Purge the Wicked refresh, followed by Mind Blast, followed by either Halo or Divine Star, and continue weaving between shadow and light as you can to be able to get the most value out of your abilities. It can kind of depend on if you need more burst on a fight like Iridius, or if you need more sustain like a fight like Khajiit, to be able to augment and look at the different ways that you can cast your spells. But knowing that your high damage spells like Penance are going to be the big ones to top your allies off is always immensely important when you need to be able to quickly spot heal and contribute as much damage as we can. I know I haven't talked as much about Shadow Word Death, but you should always be trying to take advantage of it whenever you have any enemy in execute range. Well, I know this is a lot of information and it can be very overwhelming. I'd highly recommend checking out the written guide in the description down below for a bit better emphasis and larger write-ups as well if you still have some more questions. Also, feel free to leave them in the description down below. Also, huge thanks to our patrons as well as we've been getting the Patreon started. Big thank you to Milo, Zach, Julie, Dan, Stefan, Sek, Thor, Elev, Fourth Crow, Calderon, Kevro, Simon, Merle, and John for getting us rolling with the Patreon. If you'd like to check it out and support, be sure to check it out in the description down below. Thank you so much for watching, guys. The Holy Guide will be right around the corner, followed by more dungeon guides to get you all prepared for Dragonflight Season 2. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Catch y'all next time.